despite us sending detailed letters to both of them, they just, with a federal election coming up, they don't want targets on their backs. So it's up to you people to ask them when you see them, or send them an email, get on their Facebook pages and ask them, are they for or against this incinerator? Because that's what representation is about. And if they're for it, you've got to make them aware of what your views are on that. And just quickly, just to finish off, what are we doing? So as I said before, we're collaborating with the NTN, the Boomerang Alliance, and some other groups. We've got a member of the IR8 team is on the working group for the state government's waste policies. They didn't like that when they realised that there was somebody there who was going to scrutinise things, so we're just looking to see how that shapes up. And then we also work with the relevant departments in both the Ipswich City Council and the state government. Then more importantly, what can you do? That's the big question. So you've come here, so what are you going to do when you go away, or what can you do? Because I'm just a member of the community, we're all just members of the community, right? So my suggestion to you is get on the telephone, email, social media, whatever, to your state members. The state members, this is a state issue predominantly. The state members need to know that you're angry about this and you're firmly opposed to it. Because they've told us, just like the waste industry, it's like they're reading from the same script, that we're just a noisy minority. There's just Jim Dodrell and a couple of other people who are making a big thing about this. You need to get out there and tell them that all of you are concerned about this, that this is a big issue. You don't want to be poisoned and have toxic contamination. You don't want your kids and grandkids and great-grandkids, because that's what it'll be. As soon as we get one of these incinerators over the line, then there'll be more. I'll guarantee it. That's the waste industry. They operate like the mafia. As soon as they get in one foot in the door, they'll just open the floodgate. So it won't just be the pollution and the toxics from one incinerator. You'll have more. The people in Western Sydney defeated the proposal down there. We can defeat it. Keep the pressure up, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jim. So it's really overwhelming, all of the information that we're being given, but there is a way for everyone to take action. So up in the marquees up there is a poster, so people can feel free to take a picture of that with your phone, and it does list some very simple steps that every single person can do, whether it be make a phone call, send an email, send a letter. All of these things carry a lot of weight, especially when it's the entire community gathering together to do that. So as Jim said, this is a political issue. So I know a lot of people, they try not to get involved in politics, and I mean, I am involved in politics, but it can be overwhelming and it can be depressing, and it can be really, really frustrating, but each individual person here has got the power to make change. So I really encourage you to do that. That poster is up there. It's really simple, step-by-step ways that you can do it. While we are on the topic of politics though, I will introduce our next guest speaker. So we've got Michael Berkman. So he is the state MP for Maywa, which is Brisbane's west. So it's bordering us, so they will feel the effects of this incinerator as well. But Michael has spoken in Parliament on this topic, along with Joanne Miller, so they are two real cheerleaders for this. So I'll get Mike.
Thanks, Michelle, for that introduction. Thank you all for being here. It's such an important issue, and it's wonderful to see this level of turnout on a Saturday morning. I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land on which we meet today, the Yuggera and Wugarapool people, and we're all very aware of the ongoing struggles for Indigenous people and traditional owners across the country. The situation at Deebing Creek is this really stark reminder of the ongoing dispossession that we're seeing in this country, and not just that it's a job for each of us to participate in, to call out the deep-seated underlying racism that still exists in our politics and in our community, and that's something for each one of us to work on individually. I also want to acknowledge the community campaigners and activists who have been working on these issues in Ipswich for so long now. I mean, Jim in particular, I'm sure you know this as well as I do, but he has paid a really quite extraordinary personal price for all the work that he's done over the years in fighting against the corruption that was so insidious in Ipswich City Council for years, and particularly in dealing with issues of waste management that fall disproportionately to Ipswich and affect you as locals so much more than they do anyone else around the southeast corner. Now, this is sadly not an unfamiliar scenario. As we've said, we're facing up against an incinerator just out of town now, but this is on the back of Ipswich having been treated as not just the region's or the state's waste dump, but having been used as an interstate tip for so many years after the waste levy was repealed. Now, reintroduction of that is a really important and solid step, but it's such a crazy, perverse outcome for the state government to now be looking at using funds from that waste levy to help prop up an incinerator. To actually, as Jim was saying, they're looking at giving dollars from state coffers to Remondis to actually make this project, to get it over the line. It completely defeats the purpose of the waste policies that they're looking at pushing at the moment. And look, we've just had, I really appreciate Greg being here and giving us the information that he has about the process that's yet to roll out. But let's step away from process for a moment and think about this as an issue of policy, because the state government has shown its hand on this as a policy issue. They've released this draft waste strategy which incorporates this waste to energy. What a fabulous piece of green speak nonsense that is. It is not waste to energy, it is an incinerator. Let's call it what it is. Let's not allow them to smooth over it with that. This is a move that is completely contrary to moves internationally and interstate. The international community, as Jim's outlined again, is moving away from incineration. We're recognising the environmental and the climate costs and the social costs, the health impacts of relying on incineration as any kind of power production. We've seen an incredibly successful campaign in Western Sydney stopping that incinerator from going ahead, and yet we've got the state government playing cheerleaders for this multinational company that wants to come and burn rubbish in the backyard. Now, back to the waste policy. The government's waste policy, they've just released this draft strategy, which I would encourage all of you to have a say on. It's got some good stuff in there. I'm not gonna bag everything that the government does, not for a second, but the idea that we can incorporate into that, it's got this excellent waste hierarchy, which tells us all the different ways we can most productively deal with waste, minimise community impacts, and yet in amongst this, we've got this idea of putting a dollar value on waste to burn. It's such a perverse incentive. It completely tips that hierarchy on its head, and it means that rather than using these high value, reuse or recycling processes that we know are available, we're going to create an incentive for the creation of rubbish and for the burning of rubbish. We're going to create a market for toxic inputs and this kind of destruction, when in fact we should be aiming for a closed loop, zero waste economy. This is possible. We just need to put pressure on our parliamentarians to take us there. I'll just point out that submissions are open on that draft waste policy until the 5th of April. Now, the more noise we can make, not just about the incinerator, because obviously there's a longer road in terms of getting to the end point for that process. There's plenty of time for the community to put pressure on all of our politicians about that, but this policy, we've got this tiny window now until 5th of April, so please have your say. Make sure you make a submission on that. Now, our position as a party is clear. I don't think I probably need to outline it for you, but I want to make the point that we've dealt with this both federally and at the state level. We've made absolutely clear that there should be, in fact, we've got a federal policy that calls for zero public funding for incineration or for waste to energy at all. We support the position of this community federally, and Michelle's not going to do it because she's too good an MC, but she is your candidate for Blair. She's the person you can vote for to send a strong message to both of the old parties that you're not going to stand idly by and watch them continue to carry on with business as usual, getting their donations from the waste industry, from all of their corporate mates, and making decisions that are in the interests of those companies and not in the interests of the community. Your vote is powerful. You've got to use it to send a message to the people, because sometimes that is all your politicians will listen to. Look, I guess, want to just finish off very quickly by giving a quick shout out to Joanne Miller. Good on her. Good on her for being the one who's prepared to, you know, take a bit of a stand in the party. And she has been an advocate for this community for longer than any other Labor MP in there. She is the longest standing Labor member in the state, and she gets treated with such abhorrent disrespect by some of her colleagues. So, tip of the hat to Jo. And with the greatest of respect to her, you need to send a message to the whole government, because she is not in a position to make this change. Labor, as a government, as a party, and the LNP, everyone needs to hear that the community is not going to stand for this kind of development in your backyards. Write to your local MPs, write to the Premier, write to everyone you can, flood their inboxes, because that's how you're going to get the message through. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. Please keep up the good work, keep your voices loud, and continue to keep pressure on all politicians, because they've got to feel it. They've got to feel a bit of pain if they're ever going to change their position on these sorts of things. So, very good. Thanks, folks.
Thank you for that, Michael, and thanks for that shout out. So I am running federal, so I'm more than happy to chat about that afterwards, but I won't stand here and talk myself up or talk about politics right now, because this goes far beyond that. We've got people from all political beliefs here in this crowd taking a stand together, and it's amazing to see. So this, as I said, it goes far beyond politics and far beyond one political party, and it's something that we can do. I really feel positive for what we can achieve as a community. And we have to do it, because, as Jim said earlier, this is dangerous to our health. It's something that we can't ignore. And so with that, I just want to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Connie Turney from UQ, to speak about that.
Thank you. I'd like to talk about the health impacts of incinerators. Incinerators have been proven to have a very bad impact on our health. The emission from incinerators, be that air pollution or be that fly ash, are major sources of fine particles, toxins. There's over 35 toxic metals found in them, and many of them are carcinogenic. They accumulate in your bodies. There are more than 200 organic chemicals found in the emissions. They're known to be carcinogenic, mutagenic, and hormone disruptors. Incinerators emit fine and ultrafine particles, and they cause cardiovascular mortality and lung cancer, mortality due to lung cancers. The fine particles that form in an incinerator have the ability to absorb toxic metals and organic toxins, and they will then bring this, when you inhale them, will bring that into your body and into the bloodstream, and directly into your body. Toxic metals accumulate in your body. They have been implicated in a range of emotional and behavioral problems in children, including autism, dyslexia, attention deficit, hyperactive disorders. In adults, we have dementia, depression, and Parkinson. There's also a synergistic effect which hasn't even been mentioned. So we're looking normally at one toxin at a time, but when toxins combine, there can be a synergistic effect. That means they're actually more toxic, and some combination are 500 to 1,000 times more toxic in combination. So what pollutions are we concerned about? I already said fine particles, and they're responsible for bronchitis, asthma, and other respiratory diseases. Also responsible for reduced lung functions, increased respiratory system, and increased heart disease. Now, the studies only coming out on ultrafine particles, and they are actually worse. But like I said before, the ultrafine particles can absorb toxic metals and chemicals, and they cannot be cleared by your lung. So they basically pass your immune system and go straight into the bloodstream, and they are absorbed by the cells. Now the really worrying part is that ultrafine particles can cross the blood-brain barrier and the placental barrier. So in the brain, these particles cause oxidative stress in the brain cells, and this has long-term health effect, which is accumulating over decades. They can attach to proteins and make proteins misfold by them attaching to it. And here we have concerns about Parkinson and Alzheimer's. There is also a very strong association between the pollutants the mother breathes in and the effect that has on the fetus. It has been established that there is an effect on the fetus. When they cross the placental barrier and reach the fetus, that's a very big concern, because a fetus is 10 times more vulnerable to damage, these damaging substances. And they can have very adverse effects on the developing fetus, such as premature birth, low birth weight, and they're leading to a lifelong damage to their health. So I want to go to organic toxic substances, which are emitted as well. And they are things like dioxin or furans. They stay in the environment. They accumulate in the fatty tissue. They are not broken down, and they are actually toxic at parts per billion and trillion, not like other chemicals that are toxic at parts per million. These are per billion and per trillion. They are associated with cancer, lung and liver damage, reproductive issues, thyroid disruption, and many more. Now, this is particularly important for the fetus, but because many of these substances, or most of them actually, deposit in the fatty tissue. Now, a fetus in the early pregnancy doesn't have any spare fatty tissues. The fatty tissues it has are the nervous system and the brain. So something you don't want to expose a fetus to. Chemicals that are not toxic to us have devastating effects on a fetus and on a newborn. There were some studies done on umbilical cords of babies, and they showed that all of the babies had at least 5 hazardous chemicals in their system, many up in this umbilical cord, many up to 14. When we establish safe rate of pollution, we don't take into consideration that a fetus has a higher rate of cell proliferation. It doesn't have an immune system yet, or very low response. It has decreased capacity to detoxify carcinogens, and it also has decreased capacity to repair DNA damage. This is all not taken into account when we're talking about safe limits. And the latest study basically tells us that there is no evidence to support any notion that there is actually a safe level of pollutant concentration. So in other words, it's not safe at all. So if you tell us there are safe levels, no, not for the fetus. There was a conference at Early Childhood Leukemia, and Professor Alan Breeze suggested that pollutants crossing the placenta could be linked to soaring rates of leukemia in children. Professor George Knox had done a study in polluting hotspots, such as around incinerators, and they found that 2 to 4 times that children are 2 to 4 times more likely to die from childhood cancer in these areas. So the problem is not only the acute toxins that are in the immediate surrounding neighborhood of these incinerators, but it's the fact that pollutants bioaccumulate, they enter our food chains, they will cause chronic diseases over time and in a much wider geographically area. So it will only, years after we build this thing, we will only become aware of what are actually the health implications, and the cost to our health system, which by that time it's kind of a little bit too late. Ipswich is already struggling with bad air quality due to the landfills for example, in Wetbank Plains and Collingwood Park, we have a 24 to 48% higher lung cancer rate than the average of Queensland, or the average of Australia actually. So we are already, our air is already polluted to an extent that we're seeing the effects. Now nobody talked about this, that they're all talking about that we will reduce landfills with incinerators. They forgot to mention that when I burn, like Ramondas wants to do, 500,000 tons of waste per year, well, we're getting 150,000 to 250,000 tons of very toxic ash. That actually has to go into the landfill. And it's fly ash. It's highly toxic. It's basically the residue we can't get out. They're getting out when they're cleaning the air. It's in the ash. It's readily windborne, and it's mostly small particular size. So we're having the same problem again. So where are the benefits of this for Ipswich residents? Thank you.
Thank you, Connie. It's such a wake-up call. If there is anyone that is perhaps on the fence about this, hearing Connie speak, it just shows absolutely why this needs to be stopped. So our next speaker will be welcoming Jim Dodrell back to speak a little bit more about the geographical and groundwater risks.
First of all, apologies, there was another member of our group. We have experts in geology and the environment in our group, some of which weren't able to make it this morning, so apologies for that. So you're stuck with me, I'll keep it really short. Look, basically, we have compounded problems here in Ipswich. Okay, so it's an old coal mining town. Under Swanbank, where Ramondas want to build their incinerator, there are up to 6 layers of coal seams. In between each of those coal seams is a band of sandstone. Now, sandstone is water permeable, so the water flows in aquifers between those layers of coal. Now, already we know that testing has been done on the aquifers underneath Swanbank, and there is contamination. So clearly the state government have failed in their duty of care to enforce the environmental conditions on the waste industry and to protect the environment and the people who live in the area. Can anybody tell me that there has been any reduction in the odours or the smells or dust or fire problems in recent times? No, there's been none. So the state government have failed us. They've failed us. They've been very good for the waste industry, but very bad for the people of Ipswich. So in saying that we've already got contamination, we already have an industry who don't give a damn about complying with the conditions of their environmental licenses, how can we possibly expect the state government to enforce any environmental conditions on an incinerator? And an incinerator poses some really deadly risks to people's health and to the environment, as I outlined before. So how can we possibly, if there is an approval and if there even is 1,000 conditions placed on an incinerator, how can we possibly trust the state government? And I'm going to name the Department of Environment and Science as well, because we've been working with them. We've been monitoring on their behalf, you might say, as